Right now, water flowing out of the Arctic through Fram Strait is carrying a quiet chemical alarm. Nitrate in polar surface water has dropped from about 3.1 to 1.7 micromolar. At first, that sounds too small to matter, but for plankton, nitrate is not a detail. It is food, fertilizer, the usable nitrogen that helps turn sunlight into living ocean. For years, sea ice loss was expected to open the Arctic to more plankton growth because less ice meant more light entering the water. A peer-reviewed study in Communications, Earth and Environment now shows the contradiction beneath that hope. The Arctic is receiving more light, while part of its nutrient base is being drained away. But that is not the most frightening part. The warning is not only on the surface, where satellites can watch white ice retreat into dark water. It may be hidden below, across shallow Arctic shelves, where seafloor bacteria can convert nitrate into nitrogen gas. In plain language, the bottom of the ocean may be acting like a drain beneath the Arctic food web, removing usable nitrogen before plankton can build the first layer of life. So the question is no longer only how much ice the Arctic is losing. The question is what kind of ocean is being created after the ice is gone. If the first alarm comes from plankton smaller than dust, then the system may be changing before disaster becomes visible. Liking, subscribing, and leaving a comment with their location helps show how far this Arctic warning now reaches. The place where this warning was found does not look like the beginning of a food web crisis. It is not a burning forest. It is not a flooded city. It is not a road split open by thawing ground. It is a cold corridor of ocean between Greenland and Svalbard, a gate where water from the Arctic moves south toward the North Atlantic. On maps, it is called Fram Strait. In climate science, it is one of the most important exits on Earth. That matters because Fram Strait is not only a passageway for water, it is a passageway for evidence. What leaves the Arctic through this corridor carries the memory of what has happened farther north: the melting ice, the open water, the shallow shelves, the river influence, the plankton blooms, the decay at the seafloor, and the chemistry that follows afterward. A bottle of seawater collected there is not just a bottle of seawater, it is a sample of a system upstream. In this story, the affected are not visible at first. There are no crowds on a shoreline watching waves arrive. There are no emergency sirens. The first affected organisms are microscopic. Phytoplankton, the tiny algae that float in sunlit seawater, sit at the base of the marine food web. They are so small that an entire drama can unfold inside what looks like clear water. Yet those small cells help feed zooplankton. Zooplankton feed fish. Fish feed seabirds, seals, whales, and people. What begins as chemistry can climb into biology, then into food security, then into culture, then into economies far from the Arctic ice edge. That is why Fram Strait has become a kind of chemical evidence room. Scientists have been collecting and analyzing water there for more than 2 decades, measuring nutrients that most people never think about. Nitrate, phosphate, silicate. These are not dramatic words. They do not sound like catastrophe. But in the ocean, they are part of the machinery of life. Sunlight supplies energy, but nutrients supply the material. Without enough usable nitrogen, plankton cannot simply turn brightness into growth. Light is not food by itself. The finding that makes this corridor so important is not that the Arctic is changing. That is already known. The Arctic has been warming much faster than the planet as a whole. Sea ice has been shrinking, thinning, and becoming younger. Open water seasons have expanded. Satellites have watched the white surface retreat and dark ocean absorb more heat. That story has been told many times, but the samples from Fram Strait reveal a more hidden part of the change. The water coming out of the Arctic is becoming poorer in nitrate. This is where the event becomes unusual. For years, the simplest expectation went like this: less ice means more light means more plankton, and more plankton means a more productive Arctic Ocean. In some places and during some seasons, that has been true. Arctic primary productivity has increased across many regions as sea ice has retreated and sunlight has reached waters that were once shaded. Reports from NOAA have documented that marine algae are responding to warming and sea ice decline, and in several regions, productivity has risen above past averages. But a higher pulse of life at the surface does not automatically mean a healthier or more stable system. A bloom can be bright and still be fragile. A season can be productive and still be draining the conditions that make future productivity possible. That is the tension at the center of this story. The Arctic may be gaining light while losing some of the nutrient foundation that allows that light to become food. The people closest to the immediate consequences are spread across the Arctic and subarctic world. Indigenous communities depend on marine ecosystems, not as an abstraction, but as food, identity, travel, knowledge, and continuity. Coastal villages depend on predictable seasonal patterns, on fish and marine mammals, on ice conditions that shape access and safety. Farther south, fisheries depend on the transfer of energy through marine food webs that begin with microscopic organisms. Even the North Atlantic is not separate from this story, because water does not respect the clean boundaries drawn on classroom maps. The Arctic exports water, nutrients, organisms, heat, and change. The seriousness does not come from one strange measurement, it comes from persistence. A storm can be violent and then pass, a heat wave can break records and then end, but a long-term chemical shift suggests that the background condition itself may be moving. In the Fram Strait record, scientists saw a marked reduction in nitrate in polar surface water after a statistical break around 2009. That does not mean every bottle contained the same value, or that nature suddenly obeyed a perfect switch. The ocean is noisy, currents meander, seasons vary, but the pattern was strong enough to suggest that something deeper than ordinary variability had changed. That deeper change is why official scientific language becomes careful but serious. The researchers did not need to say that the Arctic Ocean is dead. It is not. They did not need to say that every species will collapse tomorrow. That would be false. Their warning is more precise, and in some ways more disturbing. The Arctic marine system may have shifted toward nitrate limitation because fixed nitrogen is being removed more efficiently over the shallow continental shelves. In other words, the problem is not merely that ice is melting, the problem is that melting ice can change the chemical processing system beneath the sea. The phrase nitrate limitation may sound technical, but its meaning is direct. It means that plankton growth can become constrained not by sunlight, but by the availability of nitrate. A plant in a window can receive all the light it needs, but if the soil lacks nutrients, growth still weakens. The same principle applies in seawater. Phytoplankton need light, carbon dioxide, and nutrients. When one ingredient becomes scarce, the entire growth equation changes. That change can alter which plankton thrive. Larger phytoplankton, including many diatoms, often support efficient food webs because they can be eaten by larger zooplankton and can move energy upward in bigger packets. Smaller cells may still grow under nutrient-poor conditions, but energy can become trapped in more complex microbial loops. More steps can mean less efficient transfer to fish and higher predators. The issue is not simply whether there is life in the water. The issue is what kind of life dominates, at what size, in what season, and how much of that energy reaches the animals people can see. That is why the warning should matter beyond the Arctic. Modern societies often notice marine change only after the larger animals respond. Fewer fish in a net, seabirds failing to breed, whales appearing in different places, harmful algal blooms closing shellfish beds, or coastal communities losing reliable food sources. But by then, the earliest signal may have been present for years in the chemistry of seawater. Plankton are not just organisms, they are instruments. They measure the state of the ocean by living or struggling inside it. The scene at Fram Strait is also important because it shows how climate change can hide inside pathways. The public image of Arctic warming is usually a surface image, a satellite map with less white ice, a polar bear on a shrinking floe, a blue ocean opening where ice used to be. Those images matter, but they can make the crisis look flat, as if climate change is only the removal of a lid. The actual system is three-dimensional. When the lid of ice retreats, sunlight changes. Heat absorption changes, mixing changes, stratification changes, algae growth changes, organic material sinking to the bottom changes, bacteria in sediments respond, nutrients are transformed, then currents carry the result away. Fram Strait sits where those upstream changes become measurable downstream. It is the narrow place where the Arctic's hidden chemistry can be caught leaving the basin. Water flowing there has traveled through a changing polar system. Some of it has interacted with broad shelves north of Siberia and Alaska. Some has been influenced by river, water, sea ice melt, and biological activity. By the time it exits, it carries a combined chemical signature, like a witness statement written in dissolved molecules. This is why scientists care about long records. A single expedition can capture a snapshot. A long record can catch a shift. In a region as difficult as the Arctic, maintaining observations is not easy. Research vessels must work around ice, weather, darkness, cost, and political boundaries. Instruments must be calibrated. Samples must be handled carefully. Nutrients must be measured in tiny concentrations where small errors matter. Yet without that patience, the warning would look like noise. It takes years of repeated measurement to see when a system stops behaving like its old self. The official warning also connects to a broader Arctic picture. NOAA's Arctic Report Card has repeatedly described a region undergoing rapid transformation: warmer air, declining sea ice, shifting ecosystems, thawing permafrost, and communities facing new risks. Those reports do not present the Arctic as a distant wilderness separate from the rest of the planet. They present it as a connected system, a region whose physical and biological changes feed back into global climate, weather patterns, shipping, fisheries, and carbon cycling. In that context, the Fram Strait nitrate signal is not an isolated curiosity. It is one more sign that the Arctic is not only warming, it is reorganizing. That word matters. Warming sounds like a dial turning upward. Reorganizing means the parts are changing their relationships. Ice, light, nutrients, plankton, sediments, currents, and food webs are no longer fitting together in the same way. A system can keep functioning while becoming less familiar. That is what makes this kind of change so hard to recognize. It does not always announce itself as collapse. Sometimes it appears first as a new ratio in a water sample. For the viewer, the reason to care is not that everyone needs to memorize nitrate chemistry. The reason is that this is how large systems often warn first, quietly, indirectly, in a place most people are not looking. Bridges do not fail only when they fall. They fail first in stress fractures. Forests do not transform only when they burn. They transform first in dryness, insect pressure, and species shifts. Oceans do not change only when fish disappear. They change first in temperature, acidity, oxygen, nutrients, and plankton. The Arctic warning is especially unsettling because plankton sits so low in the food web that their distress can be mistaken for a minor detail. They are easy to ignore precisely because they are small, but small does not mean unimportant. In the ocean, small organisms can hold up large animals. A microscopic cell can be the first link in a chain that ends with a seabird colony, a seal hunt, a fishery, or a meal on a coastal table. There is another reason Fram Strait should hold attention. It is not only an Arctic doorway, it is part of the connection between the Arctic and the Atlantic. Changes in the Arctic do not stay politely in the north. Water masses move, heat moves, freshwater moves, nutrient patterns move. Biological effects can travel through currents and through the animals that follow them. A chemical shift in polar water can become part of a broader North Atlantic story. That does not mean one should leap to every conclusion. It does not mean a single nitrate decline explains every change in fish, whales, seabirds, or weather. It does mean that the foundation is changing in a way that deserves attention before the consequences become obvious. The most responsible warning is not the loudest one. It is the one that connects the evidence to the mechanism without pretending to know more than the data can show. At the scene then, the image is deceptively calm. A research vessel lowers instruments into dark water, bottles close at depth, samples are brought on deck. A scientist measures what cannot be seen by eye. The ocean surface may look empty. The water may look clean. The sky may look ordinary. But inside the sample is a trace of the Arctic's new condition. More light above, less usable nitrogen within, and a food web forced to respond from its smallest members upward. That is the seriousness of what is happening. The Arctic is not sending only visual warnings anymore, it is sending chemical ones. The first victims may not be towns or roads or power lines. They may be microscopic organisms trying to build life in water, where one of the key ingredients has thinned. And because those organisms feed everything above them, the quietness of the warning does not make it small, it makes it early. The number at the center of this story is small enough to disappear in ordinary language. 3.1 to 1.7 micromolar. It does not sound like a disaster. It does not sound like a number that belongs beside collapsing ice shelves, record heat, or coastal erosion. It sounds like a laboratory detail, the kind of measurement that appears in a table and gets passed over by anyone looking for something more visual. But in the Arctic Ocean, That small number describes a large change in the amount of nitrate available to the smallest plants in the sea. And because those plants sit at the base of the food web, a small chemical shift can become a biological message. In the Fram Strait record, analysed by the researchers behind the Communications, Earth and Environment study, nitrate in polar surface water averaged about 3.1 micromolar before the shift and about 1.7 micromolar afterward. The decline was not framed as the ocean running out of nitrate everywhere. It was more specific than that, and more scientifically careful. It referred to a particular water mass in a particular exit corridor over a long observational record. But that specificity is exactly why the number matters. It is not a vague, global claim. It is a chemical fingerprint in water leaving the Arctic. To understand why this matters, the unit has to be made visible. 1 micromolar means 1 micromole of a substance dissolved in 1 liter of water. A micromole is 1/1,000,000th of a mole, and a mole is a counting unit chemists use for atoms and molecules. For most people, that explanation may still feel abstract. So the easier way to think about it is this. Micromolar measurements are the ocean's fine print. They measure substances present in tiny amounts. But those tiny amounts can control whether entire populations of plankton can grow. A human being can stand beside the sea and see only water. A satellite can see the color of the surface and estimate the amount of chlorophyll. A fisherman can see whether nets come back full or thin, but nitrate works one level deeper. It is not the fish. It is not the plankton bloom itself. It is one of the chemical conditions that decides whether the bloom can happen, how large it can become, and which organisms are most likely to dominate it. Nitrate is a form of usable nitrogen. Nitrogen is needed to build proteins, enzymes, genetic material, and living cells. In the atmosphere, nitrogen is abundant, but most organisms cannot directly use ordinary nitrogen gas. In the ocean, plankton depend on fixed nitrogen, forms of nitrogen that biology can actually use. Nitrate is one of the most important of those forms. It is not simply a nutrient among many. In many marine environments, it is one of the main switches that determines growth. This is why the reduction from 3.1 to 1.7 micromolar is so important. On paper, the difference is 1.4 micromolar. In ordinary speech, that sounds microscopic, but relative to the starting point, it is a major loss. The average concentration fell by roughly 45%. Nearly half of the nitrate signal in that water mass was gone after the shift identified in the long-term record. That is the headline number. Not a wall of water, not a temperature spike that can be felt on the skin, a near halving of nitrate in water that carries the chemical memory of the Arctic Ocean. An everyday comparison helps make the strange scale clearer. Imagine a greenhouse in the far north. For most of its history, the problem was darkness. The roof was covered, and sunlight could not easily enter. Then, year by year, the roof opened, more light poured in. At first, growth increased. That was the expected story of a warming Arctic Ocean with less sea ice. But then the soil began losing fertilizer. The plants were still getting light. The space was still there. The growing season might even be longer, but the ingredient needed to build new tissue was being reduced. That is the contradiction held inside the number. The Arctic is not simply moving from dark to bright. It may also be moving from light-limited to nutrient-limited. Those are very different worlds. In a light-limited system, the question is whether enough sunlight reaches the organisms that can photosynthesize. Sea ice matters enormously because it blocks light, reflects sunlight back into space, and controls when the ocean surface becomes available for blooms. When ice retreats, the dark ocean absorbs more sunlight, and phytoplankton can take advantage of longer or more intense growing seasons in some regions. That is one reason Arctic primary productivity has increased across many areas in recent decades. But in a nutrient-limited system, the question changes. The sunlight can be there, the water can be open, the season can be longer, and still, plankton growth can hit a wall because nitrate is not available in the right amount at the right time. The limit has moved. The gatekeeper is no longer only ice cover, it is chemistry. This is what makes the headline number unsettling. A person looking at satellite images might see more open water and assume more biological opportunity. A person looking at nitrate data sees a different possibility. Open water that has gained light but lost part of its capacity to turn that light into the kind of plankton growth that supports larger food webs. The number also matters because plankton do not all respond to scarcity in the same way. When nutrients are abundant, larger phytoplankton such as many diatoms can thrive. Diatoms are often important because they package energy in larger cells and can support larger grazers. They are not the only valuable organisms in the ocean, but they are often associated with efficient transfer of energy upward. When nitrate becomes scarce, smaller cells can gain an advantage because they have a higher surface area relative to their volume and can be better at living on lower nutrient concentrations. That means the issue is not just how much plankton exists, it is what kind of plankton exists. A bloom dominated by larger cells can feed a food web differently from a community dominated by smaller cells and microbial recycling. The sea can remain alive, even productive in a narrow sense, while becoming less efficient at feeding the animals that people notice. More life at one level does not automatically mean more fish, more seabirds, or more resilient ecosystems. The structure matters. The decline from 3.1 to 1.7 micromolar therefore points toward a possible change in the architecture of the food web. It does not prove every downstream consequence by itself. It does not draw a straight line from one nutrient measurement to every fish population, but it marks a condition under which the base of the food web may begin favoring different organisms, different timing, and different pathways for energy. The Arctic Ocean is especially sensitive to this kind of shift because it has long been shaped by extremes. Ice, darkness, seasonality, river input, stratification, and shallow shelves all interact. A summer bloom is not just a burst of color. It is a timed event linked to melting ice, available light, nutrient supply, grazing pressure, and mixing. If nitrate is lower when light becomes available, then the timing and character of the bloom can change. If the bloom changes, the animals waiting for it can be mismatched. Eggs, larvae, zooplankton, fish, seabirds, and marine mammals all depend, in different ways, on timing. This is one reason the number should feel larger than it looks. 3.1 to 1.7 micromolar is not merely a chemical subtraction, it is a possible change in seasonality. It is a possible change in cell size. It is a possible change in how efficiently the Arctic turns sunlight into food. It is the difference between a system that receives light and a system that can use that light well. The comparison to fertilizer is useful, but it has limits. A farmer can add fertilizer to a field. The Arctic Ocean cannot simply be refilled that way. Its nutrients are governed by circulation, mixing, river inputs, biological uptake, sinking organic matter, and chemical transformations in sediments. Once nitrate is converted into nitrogen gas through denitrification, much of it is no longer immediately available to ordinary phytoplankton. It has left the usable nutrient pool, at least on the timescale that matters for seasonal blooms. That makes the number more than a symptom, it points toward a mechanism. The water in Fram Strait is not merely poor in nitrate by accident. The study links the decline to changes across the Arctic shelves, where sea ice loss, increased biological production, and seafloor processing can remove fixed nitrogen from the water. The headline number is the trace left downstream by a process happening across a much wider area. This is where the scale becomes difficult to hold in the mind. The measurement is tiny. The region behind it is enormous. The Arctic shelves are broad, shallow, and biologically important. They are places where light can reach productive waters, where organic matter can fall to the seafloor, and where sediments can become chemical reactors. A change measured in micromoles per liter can be connected to millions of square kilometers of shelf sea. That contrast is part of the shock. The warning is written in units so small that they seem harmless, but the system writing it is planetary in scale. It is also unusual because it complicates a common climate narrative. Many climate impacts are described as simple intensifications: hotter heat waves, stronger rainfall, higher seas, faster ice loss. Those are real and urgent. But the Arctic nitrate signal is not just an intensification, it is a change in control. The old question was, how much light could enter the Arctic Ocean? The new question is whether the nutrients are still there when the light arrives. That kind of shift is harder to communicate because it does not produce a single dramatic image. A wildfire has flames, a hurricane has clouds, a flood has brown water covering streets. Nitrate limitation has no photograph that instantly explains it. The evidence is a curve on a graph, a change in concentration, a ratio between nutrients, a plankton community responding at microscopic scale. it is not less real because it is less visible. In fact, invisibility can make it more dangerous as a warning. Systems often change before they collapse in ways that are not obvious to the public. A bridge shows stress before failure. A forest dries before it burns. A human body can show chemical markers before illness becomes visible. The Arctic Ocean may be showing something similar, a chemical marker of stress before the full ecological consequences are clear. The researchers' number also forces a more disciplined kind of fear. It does not invite panic about an ocean suddenly becoming empty. It invites attention to thresholds. At higher nitrate concentrations, plankton communities may have more room to grow when light is available. At lower concentrations, the system can become more constrained, more selective, and possibly more dependent on smaller cells and recycled nutrients. The difference between 3.1 and 1.7 micromolar is not just arithmetic. It can be the difference between abundance being limited by the sky above and abundance being limited by the chemistry within. This is why the number belongs near the beginning of the story, before the seafloor mechanism is explained, before the history of the Arctic shift is traced, before the human layer is added. The viewer needs to feel the weight of the measurement itself. The Arctic warning is not only that ice is disappearing, it is that the water left behind may not carry the same ingredients. A brighter ocean is not automatically a richer ocean. In the old image, sea ice acted like a lid. Remove the lid, and life below receives light. In the new image, the lid is being removed while a hidden drain opens beneath the food web. One change gives energy, the other removes material. Plankton need both. Without light, they cannot photosynthesize. Without nitrate, they cannot build enough living tissue to make that photosynthesis matter. That is the power of the headline number. It turns a story of possible growth into a story of possible hunger. It reveals that the Arctic transformation is not only happening in square kilometers of ice, degrees of warming, or shipping routes newly exposed by open water. It is also happening in micromoles per liter, in the faint chemistry that determines whether microscopic life can feed everything above it. And once that is understood, the number no longer feels small. It feels like the first line of a warning written in the language of the sea. The mistake is easy to make because the Arctic transformation has always been described from above. From space, the story looks almost simple. White ice retreats, dark water opens, sunlight enters, a frozen lid is pulled back from the ocean, and the surface below receives energy it used to be denied. In that image, the biological future of the Arctic seems to follow a straight line. Less ice means more light means more phytoplankton means more food. But the ocean does not run on light alone. That is the missing piece, the hidden layer, the part of the story that can disappear when the Arctic is viewed only as a shrinking white cap on a map. The deeper warning from Fram Strait is not simply that the Arctic is losing ice. It is that the loss of ice may have changed what limits life. For a long time, the Arctic Ocean was treated as a place where light was the main locked door. Sea ice blocked sunlight. Snow on top of that ice reflected even more light away. Winter darkness shut down photosynthesis. When the seasonal window opened, plankton had to move quickly, blooming in the brief period when light, nutrients, and water conditions aligned. In that older version of the system, the great constraint came from above. Now the constraint may be shifting from above to within. Not more light, but a missing Arctic nutrient. That is the turn in the story. It is not enough to ask how much ocean surface is open. It is necessary to ask what kind of water has been exposed. It is not enough to ask whether sunlight can reach the plankton. It is necessary to ask whether plankton still have enough nitrate to turn that light into cells. A brighter ocean can still be a poorer ocean if the chemistry underneath has changed. This is why the plankton matter so much. They are not only tiny plants drifting in seawater, they are the ocean's first interpreters of conditions. They respond quickly because their lives are short, their bodies are small, and their growth depends directly on the balance of light and nutrients around them. When that balance changes, plankton do not wait for human debate, they reorganize. The public image of Arctic climate change often centers on large visible things: sea ice area, polar bears, coastal erosion, thawing permafrost, new shipping lanes, storms reaching places where old infrastructure was never designed for them. Those images are real, they matter. But plankton reveal a different kind of change, one that begins before the larger animals and human systems show the damage clearly. They are not the headline most people expect. They are the warning sensor at the base of the structure. A food web can be imagined as a tower, but the Arctic version is better imagined as a winter city built on a thin foundation. At the bottom are organisms so small they can vanish inside a clear glass bottle. Above them are grazers, then fish, then birds, seals, whales, and people. If the foundation changes, the upper floors may not fall immediately. The lights may stay on. The streets may still look intact, but the load is being redistributed. That redistribution begins with a simple question: which plankton can live well in lower nitrate water? When nutrients are plentiful, larger phytoplankton can gain an advantage. Many diatoms, for example, can grow rapidly when there is enough nitrate and silicate. They often form blooms that are important for the food web because their larger cells can be eaten by larger zooplankton. That creates a relatively direct path for energy to climb from sunlight to small animals to fish. In many polar waters, that path has helped support the seasonal burst of life that larger animals depend on. When nitrate becomes scarce, smaller phytoplankton can become more competitive. Their small size gives them a different relationship with the surrounding water. They can absorb nutrients more efficiently at low concentrations because more of their cell is close to the outside environment. In nutrient-poor conditions, being small can be an advantage. But a food web built from smaller cells can behave differently. Energy may pass through more microbial steps before reaching larger animals. More recycling can happen within the microscopic community. Less material may move quickly into the bodies of the grazers that feed fish. The ocean is not dead in that scenario. It may still be biologically active. It may still contain blooms, chlorophyll, and life. But the shape of that life changes. That is the subtle danger. The Arctic can look more alive in one measurement and less supportive in another. A satellite can see surface color and estimate chlorophyll. A report can show that primary productivity has increased in several Arctic regions. Those facts can be true, but they do not settle the question of food web strength. Productivity is not the same as ecological stability. More photosynthesis in a warming Arctic does not automatically mean more food for cod, seabirds, seals, or whales. The identity, size, timing, and nutrient quality of plankton matter. This is the part often missed in simple climate narratives. A system can gain energy and lose efficiency at the same time. It can receive more sunlight and still become more constrained. It can bloom earlier, bloom differently, or bloom with cells that send energy through a longer, weaker path. The surface can look productive while the food web becomes harder to predict. The Fram Strait nitrate decline is therefore not just a chemical curiosity. It points to a possible change in the operating rules of Arctic biology. The old rule was that ice controlled light. The new rule may be that ice loss has exposed the ocean to light, while also intensifying processes that remove usable nitrogen. In other words, the same change that opens the surface may also help drain the nutrient base. That is why the phrase, "not more light, but a missing nutrient" matters. It does not deny the importance of light. Light is still essential. Without light, photosynthesis cannot occur, but it challenges the assumption that light is the only key. Life is built from matter as well as energy. Sunlight powers the factory, but nitrate supplies part of the raw material. A factory with electricity, but fewer materials cannot simply produce more. This distinction changes the emotional center of the story. The Arctic is not just becoming an ocean with less ice. It may be becoming an ocean where the old recipe for life no longer works the same way. The ingredients are being rearranged, the timing is changing, the balance between large and small organisms is shifting. And because the smallest organisms respond first, the earliest alarm is not dramatic, it is microscopic. A viewer expecting disaster may look for collapse and miss transition. Collapse is loud, transition can be quiet, collapse appears as absence, transition appears as replacement. One organism becomes less favored, another becomes more favored. One pathway weakens, another pathway expands. The total amount of life may not fall immediately, but the ecosystem's architecture changes beneath the surface. This is why plankton are such powerful witnesses. They do not need to predict the future. Their bodies record the present. If the water favors smaller cells, the plankton community shifts. If nitrate is scarce, growth patterns change. If the bloom arrives earlier than grazers are ready for it, energy can miss the animals that depend on it. If organic matter sinks differently, seafloor chemistry changes again. The warning is not contained in a single species. It is contained in relationships. The overlooked issue is also one of scale. Ice loss is measured in square kilometers. Temperature is measured in degrees. Shipping interests measure the Arctic in routes and seasons. But plankton live at the scale of molecules. For them, the most important boundary may not be the ice edge visible from space. It may be the invisible line where nitrate falls below what larger cells need to dominate. A chemical threshold can be more important than a geographic one. This creates a strange inversion. The Arctic's most visible change is at the top of the ocean, but one of its most consequential changes may be moving through the bottom of the food web. The satellite sees a surface opening. The plankton feel a nutrient closing. That sentence is the hinge of the whole story. The surface is opening, the nutrient gate is narrowing. Once that is understood, the meaning of sea ice loss becomes more complex. Ice is not just a lid that blocks light. It is part of a system that controls timing, mixing, freshwater input, stratification, habitats, and the delivery of organic matter to the seafloor. When the ice regime changes, it does not simply add light, it changes the rhythm of the ocean. More open water can lead to more production in some places, but that production can send more organic material down to sediments, where bacteria transform the chemistry of the water. The first effect looks like opportunity. The later effect can look like limitation. This is not a contradiction, it is a sequence. An Arctic with less ice can initially support stronger blooms because sunlight reaches the water. Those blooms can create more sinking organic material. More sinking organic material can fuel more microbial activity in seafloor sediments. That activity can remove nitrate from the usable pool. Then, farther downstream, water can arrive with less nitrate available for future plankton growth. What begins as extra light can end as a nutrient bottleneck. That is the hidden mechanism beginning to emerge behind the numbers. But before the mechanism is examined in full, the overlooked point must be made clearly. The Arctic crisis is not only about what is disappearing, it is about what is replacing it. Open water is replacing ice. Smaller plankton may gain ground, where larger plankton once had an advantage. Microbial recycling may become more important, where direct food web transfer once mattered more. A different ocean is not always an empty ocean. Sometimes it is an ocean that feeds itself differently. That difference has consequences. Animals higher in the food web are not adapted to abstract productivity. They are adapted to specific prey, specific sizes, specific seasons, and specific places. A seabird cannot raise chicks on a spreadsheet showing higher regional photosynthesis if the right prey is not available near the colony at the right time. A fish larva cannot benefit from a bloom that happened too early or was dominated by cells too small to support the grazers it needs. A seal does not eat nitrate, but nitrate helps shape the chain that eventually reaches the seal. So the warning from plankton is not sentimental, it is structural. The smallness of the organisms makes the warning stronger, not weaker. Large animals can move, hide, migrate, or decline slowly enough that the cause becomes tangled with many others. Plankton respond directly to the water. They are close to the chemistry. They sit where climate change stops being an atmospheric number and becomes a biological condition. That is why this story cannot be told only as a story of melting. Melting is the visible opening chapter. The deeper chapter is about limitation. What happens when a region once controlled by darkness becomes controlled by nutrient hunger? What happens when more sunlight arrives in water that has lost part of its usable nitrogen? What happens when the base of the food web shifts before the upper levels understand the message? The answer is not yet a single catastrophe, it is a new uncertainty. And in climate systems, uncertainty is not comfort, it is risk with the shape still forming. The Arctic may not be sending a warning that says life is ending, it may be sending a more complex warning. Life is reorganizing around a new chemical constraint. The old assumption that less ice simply means more growth is no longer safe enough. The question has changed. It is no longer only how much light can enter the Arctic Ocean. It is also what is left in the water when the light gets there. The mechanism has a name that sounds technical, but its logic is brutally simple. Benthique denitrification. The word benthic means the bottom environment, the seafloor and the sediments beneath it. Denitrification means a microbial process that removes usable nitrate from water and converts it into nitrogen gas or related gaseous nitrogen forms. In plain language, it is the moment when a nutrient that plankton can use is transformed into a form that most plankton cannot use directly. That is the hidden machine beneath this story. The Arctic warning is not only that ice melts, sunlight enters, and plankton respond. The warning is that the response itself can feed a process that later makes the water poorer. More light can create more growth. More growth can create more sinking organic matter. More sinking organic matter can feed bacteria in the seafloor. Those bacteria can consume nitrate as they break that material down. And when enough nitrate is converted into nitrogen gas, the surface ocean loses part of the fixed nitrogen that phytoplankton need to build new life. This is why the story feels so unsettling. The first effect of sea ice loss can look like opportunity. The later effect can look like hunger. A shallow Arctic shelf is not just a floor, it is a chemical workshop. When sea ice covers the ocean, it blocks much of the sunlight. It shortens the season when phytoplankton can grow. It limits how much organic material is produced in the water above the seafloor. But as the ice retreats, the surface changes. More light enters. Open water lasts longer. In many places, phytoplankton get a stronger chance to bloom. Tiny cells capture sunlight, use carbon dioxide, take up nutrients, and build organic matter. For a moment, the system can appear more productive. Then gravity takes over. Not every plankton cell is eaten near the surface. Not every fragment stays suspended. Some dead cells, waste particles, and bits of organic matter sink. They fall through the water column like a slow marine snow, carrying carbon and nitrogen down toward the seabed. In deep open ocean, that material may travel a long way before reaching sediments. But on the Arctic shelves, the water can be shallow. The distance from bloom to bottom is short. What grows near the surface can reach the seafloor quickly enough to become fuel for sediment microbes. That is where the hidden drain begins to open. Bacteria in the sediment live by breaking down organic matter. They are not villains, they are part of the normal recycling system of the ocean. Life produces material. Material sinks. Microbes decompose it. Nutrients are transformed, recycled, or removed. Without microbial recycling, the ocean would not function. But when the balance changes, recycling can become a loss pathway. The key is oxygen. In well-oxygenated conditions, microbes can use oxygen as they break down organic matter. Oxygen is an efficient chemical partner for respiration, but sediments are layered environments. Near the surface of the mud, oxygen may be present. A little deeper, oxygen becomes scarce because microbes use it up faster than it can be resupplied. In those low oxygen zones, microbes turn to other chemical tools. One of those tools is nitrate. Nitrate contains oxygen and nitrogen. Certain bacteria can use nitrate in respiration when oxygen is limited. Step by step, nitrate is reduced through chemical forms until much of it becomes nitrogen gas. That gas can leave the sediment, move into the water, and eventually escape the usable nutrient pool for ordinary phytoplankton. This is the paradox. Nitrate helps build plankton. Plankton die and sink. Their remains feed bacteria. The bacteria remove nitrate. The removal of nitrate can then limit the next generation of plankton. A food web can begin to eat away at one of its own foundations. The Arctic shelves make this process especially important because they are so large. The Communications, Earth and Environment study described Arctic shelves as covering more than half of the Arctic basin and a major share of the world's continental shelf area. That means the seafloor is not a small edge feature in the Arctic. It is one of the dominant parts of the system. In many oceans, the deep basin defines the scale. In the Arctic, the shallow shelves are enormous enough to act like a continental scale reactor. That matters because benthic denitrification does not need to happen everywhere equally to matter. It only needs to become strong across enough shelf area to change the nutrient signature of water leaving the Arctic. The Fram Strait record matters because it may be catching the downstream result of that shelf processing. A sample taken in one corridor can carry the memory of reactions that happened over broad regions upstream. The process can be followed like a chain. First, sea ice retreats. Second, more light reaches shallow shelf waters. Third, phytoplankton production increases in places where light had been limiting. Fourth, more organic matter sinks toward the sediments. Fifth, microbes in the sediments break that material down. Sixth, low oxygen microenvironments favor processes that consume nitrate. Seventh, denitrification converts fixed nitrogen into gas. Eighth, Downstream waters carry less nitrate. Ninth, plankton growth becomes more limited by nitrogen. 10th, the food web begins to reorganize around smaller cells and weaker nutrient supply. None of those steps requires fantasy. Each step is ordinary ocean science. The frightening part is not that an impossible process has appeared. The frightening part is that a normal process may be intensifying under a new climate state. That is how tipping points often hide. They do not always require new physics or unknown chemistry. Sometimes they are familiar processes pushed into unfamiliar dominance. Benthic denitrification has always existed. Sediment microbes have always transformed nitrogen. The ocean has always had nutrient cycles, but climate change can alter the balance among those cycles. A process that once acted as one part of the background can become a controlling force. The question is not whether bacteria have suddenly learned a new trick. The question is whether sea ice loss has fed them enough sinking material over enough shallow seafloor to remove nitrate faster than the system can replace it. That is where the Arctic shelves become more than geography. They become machinery. A shelf sea is shallow enough for the surface and bottom to stay connected. A bloom at the top does not vanish into an unreachable abyss. It can become sediment fuel within the same seasonal system. The seafloor does not sit passively beneath the water. It answers the surface. When the surface produces more organic matter, the bottom receives more. When the bottom receives more, microbial chemistry changes. When microbial chemistry changes, nutrient inventories change. Then the surface inherits the consequences. The system is circular, but not perfectly balanced. Some nutrients are recycled back into the water and can be reused. Some nitrogen can return in forms that organisms may use after additional transformations. But denitrification is different because it removes fixed nitrogen from the biologically available pool by converting it into gas. For most phytoplankton, nitrogen gas in the atmosphere or dissolved in seawater is like food locked behind glass. It is abundant but inaccessible. Only specialized nitrogen-fixing organisms can convert nitrogen gas back into usable forms, and in much of the Arctic marine system, that replacement does not appear strong enough to erase the nitrate loss quickly. That is why the word usable matters. The Arctic is not losing nitrogen from the universe. It is losing nitrogen in a form that the base of the food web can readily use. The distinction is everything. A pantry can be full of sealed cans with no opener. A city can have water behind a dam with no pipes. An ocean can contain nitrogen gas, while plankton still face nitrate hunger. This is also why the process connects chemistry to ecology so directly. Phytoplankton do not respond to total planetary nitrogen. They respond to the nutrient forms dissolved around them in the sunlit layer during the growing season. If nitrate is low at that moment, growth changes. If growth changes, the rest of the food web is forced to follow. The first practical consequence is a change in plankton size. Larger phytoplankton, including many diatoms, often do well when nutrients are more available. They can bloom rapidly and create food that larger zooplankton can graze efficiently. Those zooplankton then support fish, seabirds, and marine mammals. The path is not perfectly simple, but it is relatively direct. Large cells help create large packets of energy. Smaller phytoplankton can do better when nutrients are scarce. Their small bodies give them a high surface area compared with their volume, allowing them to take up dissolved nutrients effectively when concentrations are low. They can keep living in water where larger cells may struggle. That does not mean they are bad. It means they support a different kind of system. A food web dominated by smaller cells often sends more energy through microbial loops. Tiny organisms are consumed by other tiny organisms, and energy is recycled within the microscopic community before it reaches larger grazers. Each extra step can lose energy as heat, respiration, or waste. By the time the chain reaches fish, less may remain. The ocean can still be active, it can still be green, it can still contain life. But it may become less efficient at feeding the animals people recognize. That is the second practical consequence. The Arctic may become harder to read. A satellite might see chlorophyll and suggest that plankton are present. A seasonal productivity estimate might show that photosynthesis occurred. But those measurements cannot always reveal whether the food web is efficient, whether the right prey appeared at the right time, or whether larger animals received enough energy. A low-nitrate Arctic could still produce blooms that look impressive from above while becoming less reliable below. The third consequence reaches carbon. Phytoplankton absorb carbon dioxide during photosynthesis. When they die, or when animals that eat them produce sinking waste, some carbon can descend into deeper waters or sediments. This is part of the biological pump, the ocean's ability to move carbon from the atmosphere-facing surface into the interior ocean. Larger cells and heavier particles can often sink more effectively. Smaller cells can be recycled closer to the surface. If nitrate limitation favors smaller plankton and more microbial recycling, then carbon transfer to depth may change. That does not mean the Arctic suddenly stops taking up carbon. It means the machinery that moves carbon may become less predictable. The same nutrient shift that matters for fish and seabirds can also matter for the climate system. The fourth consequence is timing. Arctic life is intensely seasonal. Many organisms depend on short windows when food becomes available. Zooplankton need blooms. Fish larvae need zooplankton. Seabirds need fish near colonies during breeding. Marine mammals track prey and ice conditions across large regions. If nutrient limitation changes when blooms happen, how long they last, or which cells dominate, timing mismatches can ripple upward. A bloom that occurs too early, too weakly, or in the wrong form can become food that misses its consumer. This is why nitrate loss is more than chemistry. It changes the calendar. The fifth consequence is geography. The Arctic is not one uniform bowl. It contains shelves, basins, currents, inflows, outflows, ice-covered regions, river-influenced regions, and Atlantic-influenced regions. Benthic denitrification may be strongest where shallow shelves receive enough organic matter and where sediment conditions favor nitrate removal. Other regions may respond differently. Some waters may still receive nutrient resupply from mixing or Atlantic inflow. Some areas may remain more productive for a time. The danger is not that every part of the Arctic changes in the same way at the same speed. The danger is that the old map of limitations becomes unreliable. A system can become patchier. Some places may bloom strongly. Some may become nutrient-starved. Some may shift towards smaller cells. Some may hold on to larger blooms longer. Predators that depend on predictable patterns may face a moving target. The mechanism also explains why the warning can persist. If nitrate has been removed from the usable pool, a short-term increase in sea ice would not automatically refill the nutrient inventory. A colder season or a temporary ice rebound might change light conditions, but the nitrogen already converted to gas does not instantly return as nitrate. Recovery would depend on circulation, mixing, new nutrient inputs, and biological transformations over longer timescales. That is why researchers speak carefully about thresholds and altered regimes. The system does not reset like a light switch. This is the meaning of a chemical tipping point in this context. It is not necessarily a dramatic cliff where the ocean dies overnight. It is a shift in which feedbacks begin to reinforce a new condition. Less ice creates more light. More light can create more production. More production can fuel sediment denitrification. More denitrification lowers nitrate. Lower nitrate changes future production. The system begins to carry the memory of ice loss in its chemistry. The hidden drain becomes part of the new baseline. This mechanism also changes how responsibility is understood. The bacteria are not the cause in the moral sense. They are not attacking the Arctic. They are doing what bacteria do when organic matter arrives and oxygen becomes limited. The deeper driver is the climate-altered environment that changes how much light enters, how much production occurs, how much material sinks, and how strongly sediments process nitrogen. The microbes are the workers. The warming climate is changing the factory's supply chain. That distinction matters because it prevents a false story. The danger is not a mysterious new poison. It is not plankton suddenly failing without reason. It is not a random collapse. It is a connected response. Physical change creating biological change feeding sediment chemistry returning as nutrient limitation. The Arctic is revealing climate change as a system, not a single variable. A person can measure sea ice extent and see one layer. A vessel can collect water in Fram Strait and see another. A sediment core can reveal the microbial processing below. A plankton sample can show the biological response. None of these alone tells the entire story. Together, they show a feedback loop. That loop can be imagined as a bank account. Nitrate is the spendable balance for plankton growth. Each bloom spends some of it by turning nutrients into living tissue. Recycling deposits some back. Mixing and currents can bring in more, but denitrification is a withdrawal that leaves the local biological account. If withdrawals grow faster than deposits, the balance drops. The account may not hit zero, but it can fall low enough to change behavior. Large plankton become harder to support. Smaller organisms take over more space. The food web adjusts to scarcity. The Arctic shelf seas are where many of those withdrawals may be increasing. The study's estimates point towards substantially larger fixed nitrogen loss from major Arctic shelves under the changed ice and productivity regime. The exact number is less important than the direction and scale. The shelves are not merely receiving climate change, they are processing it chemically and exporting the result. Water that later exits through Fram Strait can arrive already marked by this loss. This makes plankton the warning, but not the whole mechanism. Plankton are the visible biological responders under a microscope. The true machinery connects ice, light, organic matter, sediment bacteria, nitrogen chemistry, currents, and food webs. It is a chain with no single dramatic villain. That is why it is so easy to miss. There is no explosion when nitrate becomes nitrogen gas. There is no color change that a person standing on the deck can see. The water does not turn black. The sky does not darken. A bottle of low nitrate water may look as clean and cold as any other sample. But chemically, part of the future bloom has already been removed. That image should stay in the mind, a clear bottle holding an absence. The absence is not empty space. It is missing potential, missing diatoms, missing food packets, missing grazing opportunities, missing carbon sinking to depth, missing predictability in a food web built around seasonal timing. A nutrient decline does not have to look dramatic to matter. It changes what the ocean can do next. And this is where the hidden mechanism becomes a system warning. The Arctic Ocean has often been described as a victim of warming, a place where ice retreats because the planet traps more heat. That is true, but incomplete. The Arctic is also becoming an active processor of change. Its shelves are turning physical warming into chemical transformation. Its sediments are translating extra surface production into nitrogen loss. Its currents are carrying that signal outward. Its plankton are revealing the consequences. The phrase benthic denitrification may sound cold and academic, but behind it is a simple and haunting picture. The seafloor breathing through nitrate, the mud converting food web fertilizer into gas, the foundation of Arctic life becoming thinner in water that now receives more sunlight than before. More light above, less usable nitrogen below. That is the mechanism, that is the hidden drain, and if it continues, the Arctic food web will not need to vanish to be transformed. It only needs to be rebuilt from smaller cells, weaker transfers, altered seasons, and a nutrient base that no longer behaves like it once did. The signal did not appear out of nowhere. That is what makes it harder to dismiss. If the Fram Strait nitrate decline had appeared in one expedition, one season, or one cluster of unusual samples, it could have been treated as noise. The Arctic is not a quiet laboratory tank. It is a moving, freezing, thawing, wind-driven ocean. Currents shift, storms mix layers, river water enters from continents, Atlantic water pushes in from the south. Sea ice forms, drifts, melts, and exports fresh water. Any single year can mislead. Any single map can exaggerate. Any single bloom can look like a new trend before the next season contradicts it. But the nitrate signal sits inside a longer pattern. The study published in Communications, Earth and Environment examined water collected at Fram Strait across more than 2 decades, from the late 1990s into the 2020s. The important detail was not simply that nitrate went down. It was that the record showed a statistical break around 2009. Before that break, polar surface water leaving the Arctic carried a higher average nitrate concentration. After that break, it carried much less. The ocean did not announce the shift with a storm. It left a line in chemistry. A line like that does not prove everything by itself, but it asks a serious question. What changed upstream? The answer begins with sea ice, but not in the simple way most people imagine. The Arctic did not merely lose a white cover from the surface, it changed the behavior of that cover. Ice became thinner, ice became younger, ice moved faster, ice spent less time inside the Arctic basin before being exported or melted. The system did not only shrink, it accelerated. That matters because Arctic sea ice is not just frozen water sitting still. It is part of a transport system. Ice forms over shallow seas. It incorporates salts, particles, algae, and chemical signals. It drifts with winds and currents. It crosses the basin. It melts and releases fresh water. It affects stratification, light, timing, and the routes through which surface waters remember what happened over the shelves. For decades, one of the great Arctic pathways has been the transpolar drift. It carries ice and surface water from the Siberian side of the Arctic toward Fram Strait. In the older regime, sea ice could spend several years traveling through the basin. That long residence time gave the ice and upper ocean a different relationship with the regions below and around them. But as the Arctic warmed, ice residence time shortened. The Communications, Earth and Environment study describes a drop from about 4.3 years to about 2.7 years in the time sea ice stayed inside the Arctic basin. That is not a small operational detail. It means the Arctic's conveyor belt changed speed. A faster conveyor changes what reaches the exit. At the same time, September sea ice concentration over shelves in Siberia and Alaska fell sharply from the 1990s onward. The study describes a reduction of roughly half over those broad shelf regions. That loss did more than expose open water in a picturesque sense. It allowed more sunlight to enter shallow seas where the seafloor is close enough to receive the consequences of surface production. It lengthened the open water season. It changed how much organic matter could be produced and how much of that material could fall into sediments. This is why the 2009 signal was not random. It appeared after years of physical reorganization. The Arctic was already moving toward a new ice regime. The shelves were already receiving more light. The transport pathways were already changing. The water leaving through Fram Strait was already becoming a combined report from a different upstream system. The comparison to earlier Arctic thinking is important. For a time, the story of sea ice loss and biology seemed almost hopeful in one narrow sense. Less ice meant more light. More light meant greater phytoplankton production in some areas. Satellites and field observations showed increases in Arctic primary productivity as open water expanded. In the early stages of sea ice decline, that pattern made intuitive sense. A darker ocean surface received more sunlight. Plankton responded. The Arctic looked as if warming was making the ocean biologically more active. But history in Earth systems often begins with an apparent benefit and ends with a hidden bill. A forest can grow faster under warmer conditions until drought, stress, insects, and fire risk overtake the gain. A lake can become more productive under nutrient input until oxygen collapses at depth. A coastal zone can bloom after fertilizer runoff until decay strips oxygen from the water and creates a dead zone. In each case, more growth is not the same as more stability. More production can become the fuel for another process. The Arctic shelf story follows that darker logic. More light can mean more plankton. More plankton can mean more sinking organic matter. More sinking organic matter can mean stronger microbial respiration in sediments. Stronger sediment processing can mean more nitrate removal through denitrification. Then the next generation of water leaving the shelves carries less nitrate. A gain at one stage becomes a loss at another. This kind of delayed consequence has a long scientific history. Coastal dead zones around the world have shown that nutrient and oxygen systems can shift in ways that are not obvious from the surface. In the Gulf of Mexico, for example, excess nutrients from rivers can stimulate large algal blooms. When that organic matter sinks and decomposes, oxygen is consumed, and bottom waters can become hypoxic. The mechanism is not identical to the Arctic nitrate story, but the lesson is similar. The biological response to changing inputs can trigger a chemical response below, and that lower layer can reshape the ecosystem. The Arctic is different because the problem is not a simple overload of fertilizer from farms. It is a climate-driven reorganization of light, ice, shelf production, and nitrogen cycling. But the pattern is familiar enough to be taken seriously. The surface event is only the opening act. The deeper chemical consequence is where the system begins to show its new character. Another useful precedent comes from the Bering Sea, where recent marine heat waves and sea ice loss have been linked to major ecosystem disruption. In the northern Bering and southern Chukchi region, reduced ice, warmer waters, and changing food webs have affected species that depend on cold conditions and seasonal production. The collapse of eastern Bering Sea snow crab became one of the clearest public examples of how a marine system can cross into a state that management systems were not prepared to handle. The cause was not one simple factor, but a compound change involving temperature, metabolism, habitat contraction, and food web pressure. That comparison should be handled carefully. The Fram Strait nitrate signal does not mean the same thing is already happening everywhere in the Arctic. It does not mean every fishery will follow the snow crab story, but it shows why early chemical and biological warnings matter. By the time a harvest collapses, the system has often been changing for years. The public sees the shortage at the end. The ocean begins the story much earlier. The 2009 break belongs in that category, an early line, not a final collapse. It is a signal that the Arctic's old controls may have weakened. Before the break, the relationship between ice loss, light, and productivity could still be described as a relatively direct response in many regions. After the break, the nitrate decline suggests that another limit had become more important. The system had not stopped producing life. It had changed the conditions under which life could be produced. The nutrient ratios strengthen that interpretation. The study did not only look at nitrate by itself, it also examined relationships among nitrogen, phosphorus, and silicon. Those ratios matter because different plankton groups need nutrients in different proportions. Diatoms, for instance, require silicon to build their glass-like shells, along with nitrogen and other nutrients to grow. If nitrogen becomes scarcer relative to phosphorus or silicon, the chemical environment can push the ecosystem toward different plankton communities. A ratio can be a fingerprint of limitation. After the shift, the water was not merely lower in nitrate, it carried signs of a changed nutrient balance. That is why the interpretation goes beyond a single missing ingredient. The Arctic's chemical recipe was changing, and recipes matter. A loaf of bread is not determined only by the presence of heat. It needs flour, water, yeast, salt, timing, and proportion. An ocean bloom is not determined only by sunlight. It needs nitrate, phosphate, iron, silicate for some species, stable enough water, the right season, and grazing pressure that does not remove cells faster than they grow. Change the proportion, and the result changes even if one ingredient becomes more abundant. In that sense, 2009 is not a magic date. It is a marker where several slow processes became visible together. Sea ice had been declining for years, shelf waters had been opening, Arctic residence times had shortened. The transpolar drift was carrying a different kind of surface water toward Fram Strait. The seafloor had more opportunity to process organic matter. The chemical signal finally emerged as a break in the record. That is how regime shifts often appear in retrospect. At the time, there may be no single day when the system announces itself. No one stands on the deck of a research vessel and watches a tipping point pass under the hull. The water keeps moving. The waves keep forming. The instruments keep recording values that look technical and disconnected. Only after enough years are placed side by side does the shape become visible. Before the shift, one set of relationships. After the shift, another. The history of climate science is full of such moments. Coral reefs do not reveal bleaching risk only in the year of mass mortality. The warning builds through marine heat stress, repeated bleaching, disease pressure, and reduced recovery time. Forests do not become fire-prone only when flames appear. The warning builds through heat, drought, insect outbreaks, and fuel drying. Ice sheets do not destabilize only when a glacier suddenly retreats. The warning builds through ocean warming, melt at grounding lines, thinning, cracking, and acceleration. The Arctic nitrate signal belongs to this family of warnings because it is not a spectacle. It is a change in background conditions. A background condition is dangerous precisely because it shapes everything else. When the baseline temperature rises, heat waves become easier to produce. When the baseline moisture changes, floods and droughts behave differently. When the baseline nutrient supply changes, food webs begin from a new starting point. The Arctic's nitrate decline suggests that future plankton blooms may be forced to operate under rules different from the ones that shaped the past. The comparison with the old Arctic is therefore not only a comparison of ice cover, it is a comparison of ecological possibilities. In the older state, sea ice imposed darkness and seasonality, but the nutrient reservoir in polar surface water was stronger. When light arrived, larger blooms could draw on that available nitrate. In the newer state, light may arrive more often and for longer periods. but nitrate may be lower in key waters. The growing season opens with a weaker pantry. That changes which organisms can take advantage of the light. The word pantry is useful because it makes the timing clear. A household can have a longer day and a warmer kitchen, but if the pantry is half empty, meals change. A region can have more open water, but if nitrate is depleted, plankton growth changes. The Arctic did not simply become more hospitable to life, it became more complicated. That complication is what makes the 2009 signal so important for the rest of the story. It gives the narrative a before and after. Before, the dominant expectation centered on light. After, the evidence points toward nutrient limitation. Before, ice loss looked like an opening. After, it also looks like a drain. This does not mean that every later year must look identical. Some seasons may still produce large blooms. Some regions may still see strong productivity. Atlantic inflow, storms, mixing, and local shelf processes can create exceptions. The Arctic remains varied and dynamic, but a regime shift does not require every place to change in lockstep. It means the balance of forces has changed enough that the old expectation no longer explains the system reliably. That is the sober conclusion from the history. The signal was not random because it fits too many pieces at once. It fits the loss of summer sea ice over broad shelves. It fits the shorter residence time of ice in the basin. It fits increased exposure of shallow waters to light. It fits stronger organic matter delivery to sediments. It fits denitrification as a nitrogen removal pathway. It fits the lower nitrate measured downstream in Fram Strait. It fits the possibility that plankton communities will shift under nutrient stress. One line in a chemistry record becomes a chapter in a larger transformation. And the most haunting part is that the warning did not need to break the surface to be real. The Arctic did not have to stop freezing completely. The food web did not have to collapse in one season. A major fishery did not have to fail before the signal mattered. The early evidence appeared in the quiet place where many system changes first appear, in the relationship between a physical shift and a chemical response. That is why 2009 should not be treated as an isolated year. It should be treated as a door in the record. On one side is an Arctic, where ice loss could still be imagined mainly as an increase in light. On the other side is an Arctic where the consequences of that light have begun feeding back through the seafloor, stripping away nitrate, and changing the foundation of the food web. The event did not become frightening because it was sudden. It became frightening because it was consistent. The human layer of this story begins far below the scale of the human eye. It begins with plankton. That may seem strange, because plankton do not look like infrastructure. They do not look like homes, harbours, roads, electrical systems, fishing fleets, school kitchens, hospital supply chains, or village freezers. They do not appear in government budgets the way bridges and airports do. They do not stand in front of cameras after a storm. They do not give interviews, file insurance claims, or evacuate from danger. But in the Arctic, plankton are part of the infrastructure. They are living infrastructure, the first biological layer that supports the animals and communities above them. They convert light, carbon dioxide, and nutrients into the first food in the marine system. Without that conversion, the rest of the chain has nothing firm to stand on. A food web is not separate from human systems when people depend on fish, marine mammals, seabirds, and stable seasons. It becomes part of food security. It becomes part of culture. It becomes part of economics. It becomes part of survival in places where the ocean is not scenery, but pantry, road, memory, and identity. That is why a nitrate decline in polar surface water is not only a laboratory result, it is a warning about vulnerability. The first communities exposed to that vulnerability are the ones closest to the Arctic marine system. Across northern coasts, indigenous communities have built knowledge, diets, travel routes, hunting practices, and seasonal calendars around ice, ocean, and animals. The relationships are specific. They are not generic words like resources. A seal is food, but also knowledge, skill, sharing, equipment, weather judgment, and intergenerational memory. A fish run is not only protein, it is timing, place, labor, trust, and continuity. Sea ice is not only frozen water, it can be a platform, a route, a hunting ground, a shield from waves, and a map that changes by season. When plankton communities shift, The effect does not move upward in a straight, clean line. Nature rarely offers such simplicity, but the pathway is real enough to matter. Phytoplankton feed zooplankton, zooplankton feed fish and other small animals. Fish feed birds, seals, whales, and people. Changes at the base can alter what appears higher up when it appears, how abundant it becomes, and how predictable it remains. Predictability is the key word. A community can adapt to hardship more easily than to chaos. A difficult season can be endured if the pattern remains recognizable. But when the timing of ice, blooms, fish movement, storms, and animal behavior begins shifting together, knowledge built over generations faces a moving target. The old signs may still exist, but they no longer point to the same outcomes. A wind that once meant safe travel may now coincide with thinner ice. A season that once brought certain prey may now bring different prey, smaller prey, or prey that arrives too early or too late. A coastline that once remained protected by ice may face open water waves for longer. The plankton warning belongs inside that larger instability. The danger is not that nitrate falls and a village immediately loses food the next morning. That is not how this works. The danger is that the base of the food web becomes less reliable over time, while the physical environment also becomes more dangerous. The same Arctic that is losing nitrate in some waters is also losing sea ice, warming rapidly, experiencing coastal erosion, changing storm exposure, and forcing communities to make decisions under uncertainty. That is why this story is more serious than its headline number. 1.7 micromolar is a chemical value. It can sound distant, but its meaning expands when placed inside a human system already under pressure. A nutrient shift does not arrive alone. It arrives alongside thawing permafrost that damages foundations, roads, runways, fuel tanks, and water systems. It arrives alongside coastal erosion that threatens homes and burial grounds. It arrives alongside changing sea ice that affects travel safety and hunting access. It arrives alongside new shipping interest, industrial pressure, and geopolitical attention. It arrives into communities that often did little to create the warming now reshaping their region. The vulnerability is layered. At the biological layer, plankton may shift towards smaller cells under nitrate limitation. At the ecological layer, energy transfer to larger animals may become less efficient or less predictable. At the food security layer, fish and marine mammals may change location, timing, or condition. At the community layer, people may face more uncertainty in harvests and travel. At the infrastructure layer, ports, freezers, roads, airstrips, fuel storage, and emergency services may already be strained by thaw and storms. At the governance layer, management systems may be built around historical baselines that no longer describe the ocean. That is the human layer of a chemical tipping point. It is not one disaster, it is a stack of dependencies. Modern society is trained to recognize infrastructure when it is made of steel, concrete, copper, asphalt, or fiber optic cable. But in the Arctic, the food web itself is infrastructure. Ice is infrastructure. Seasonal predictability is infrastructure. Long-term observation is infrastructure. The ability to forecast safe travel, animal migration, bloom timing, fish movement, and storm exposure is infrastructure. When those systems weaken, the damage is not always captured by a broken bridge. Sometimes it is captured by a missed harvest, a failed hunt, a longer boat trip, a more dangerous crossing, or a community freezer that is less full than it used to be. The weak points are not evenly distributed. People far from the Arctic may experience the story as scientific news. People near the Arctic may experience it as another source of uncertainty in a life already being reorganized by warming. Large research institutions may speak of nitrate limitation, denitrification, and plankton community structure. A coastal household may experience the downstream reality as higher fuel costs, longer travel, different prey, thinner ice, or less confidence in the timing of the season. The same system change has different meanings depending on how close a person lives to the first consequences. This is why the story must not turn plankton into an abstract symbol. They are living organisms, but they are also the opening balance in an ecological account. When that account changes, every dependent system must recalculate. Fisheries are one of those systems. The Arctic and subarctic seas support commercial and subsistence fisheries that depend on the transfer of energy from plankton to zooplankton to fish. Fisheries management often works with stock assessments, catch limits, surveys, models, and historical recruitment patterns. Those tools are essential, but they can become less reliable when the underlying ecosystem shifts. A fish population does not respond only to fishing pressure. It responds to temperature, prey availability, spawning conditions, larval survival, predator pressure, oxygen, acidity, and the structure of the plankton community below it. A nitrate-limited food web can complicate all of those calculations. If larger plankton decline relative to smaller cells, the zooplankton community may change. If zooplankton change, fish larvae may face different food quality or timing. If fish recruitment becomes more variable, fisheries become harder to manage. A catch limit based on an older ecosystem may no longer protect the same future if the food base is changing. Management systems can adjust, but only if the change is detected early and taken seriously. That leads to another fragile layer: scientific monitoring. The Arctic is one of the hardest regions on Earth to observe consistently. Research vessels are expensive, weather is dangerous, ice conditions change, instruments can be damaged, sampling seasons are short, political tensions can limit cooperation. Satellite observations are powerful, but satellites cannot directly measure every nutrient profile, microbial process, or plankton community shift under the surface. The most important warning may require ships, moorings, water samples, laboratory analysis, autonomous instruments, and long-term funding. That means the observation system is itself a point of vulnerability. A nitrate decline can only become a warning if someone is there to measure it. A plankton shift can only become evidence if sampling continues long enough to separate trend from noise. A hidden chemical drain can only be understood if scientists can connect water chemistry, seafloor processes, ice history, circulation, and biology. Without that infrastructure of knowledge, the Arctic does not stop changing. It simply changes in the dark. The human risk, then, includes the risk of blindness. Not literal blindness, but institutional blindness. The danger that funding cycles are shorter than ecological shifts. The danger that monitoring stops just as the system crosses into a new state. The danger that decision-makers notice the collapse of a fishery or the distress of a community, but miss the chemical warning that began years earlier. The danger that satellite images of open water create a false sense of understanding while the nutrient base underneath is being rewritten. In this sense, the Fram Strait record is not just a data set. It is a form of public safety infrastructure. It caught a change that the surface alone could not explain. It gave language to a risk that would otherwise remain hidden inside clear water. Ports and coastal infrastructure add another layer. As sea ice retreats, Arctic and subarctic waters attract more attention from shipping, tourism, research, resource extraction, and military activity. More open water can look like more access, but access does not equal safety. Ports built for one climate may face a different one. Coastal erosion can threaten storage tanks and buildings. Thawing permafrost can undermine roads and runways. Longer open water seasons can expose shorelines to waves that sea ice once dampened. Emergency response capacity is often limited by distance, weather, darkness, and sparse infrastructure. Now add ecological uncertainty. A harbour may be physically usable, but the fish distribution may shift. A community may have a runway, but the food system may become less predictable. A fishing fleet may have vessels, but the prey base may reorganize. A management agency may have regulations, but the baseline may be moving. A supply chain may have cold storage, but local harvest reliability may weaken. The visible infrastructure and the living infrastructure are linked. That link is often underestimated. A road is useful because it connects people to places where life can be sustained. A freezer is useful because food can be stored. A port is useful because fish or supplies can move through it. A forecast is useful because seasonal patterns are reliable enough to make planning possible. When the ecosystem becomes less predictable, physical infrastructure loses some of its certainty. It still exists, but the conditions it was built to serve change. This is the meaning of systemic risk. The nitrate signal is not dangerous only because phytoplankton may be affected. It is dangerous because many systems assume the base of the food web will keep behaving within a known range. Food systems assume it. Fisheries assume it. Cultural practices assume it. Wildlife management assumes it. Scientific models assume it, unless they are updated. Infrastructure planning assumes it, often indirectly. When the base changes, all those assumptions become less secure. The Arctic also exposes a justice problem. The people most directly affected by changes in ice, marine food webs, and coastal stability are not the largest historical emitters of greenhouse gases. Many northern communities have contributed little to the global emissions that drive rapid Arctic warming, yet they face some of the earliest and most intense consequences. The chemical story of nitrate limitation may sound detached from climate justice, but it is not. A hidden nutrient shift can become a lived burden when it changes food availability, travel safety, economic opportunity, and cultural continuity for communities already adapting to multiple disruptions. That burden is not only material, it is emotional and cultural. When an ecosystem becomes less predictable, it can erode confidence in inherited knowledge. Elders may still understand the land and sea deeply, but the conditions may no longer behave like the world in which that knowledge was formed. Younger generations may face a double pressure, maintaining cultural practices while navigating a climate-altered environment. The loss is not only measured in kilograms of fish or number of hunting days, it is measured in uncertainty, risk, and the strain placed on continuity. The story reaches beyond indigenous communities as well. Commercial fisheries, research economies, conservation agencies, coastal planners, insurers, shipping operators, and national governments all depend on Arctic predictability. A changing plankton base can influence fish distributions. Fish distributions can influence quotas, markets, livelihoods, and political disputes. Ecosystem shifts can cross borders because marine animals and water masses cross borders. A chemical change that begins in polar water can become part of a larger North Atlantic management problem. This is why the phrase small plankton is misleading. They are small in size, not in consequence. They reveal whether the ocean can still turn light into food in the way larger animals depend on. They reveal whether a bloom is likely to be built from larger cells or smaller cells. They reveal whether energy may move efficiently upward or remain trapped longer in microbial recycling. They reveal whether a system has crossed from one limiting condition into another. They expose fragility before the fragility becomes visible at the surface. The danger is also greater than the headline number because the number does not capture timing. A food web can suffer not only from less food, but from food arriving at the wrong moment. Arctic animals are adapted to pulses. A bloom feeds zooplankton. Zooplankton feed fish larvae. Fish feed birds and mammals. If nitrate limitation changes the bloom's strength, duration, or composition, consumers may miss the pulse. A small mismatch at the base can become a large reproductive failure higher up. The arithmetic of the headline cannot show that. The ecosystem calendar can. Nor does the headline number capture resilience. A healthy system can absorb shocks. It has redundancy, diversity, and recovery pathways. But a system already stressed by warming, ice loss, acidification, oxygen changes, shifting species, and human activity has less room for error. Nitrate limitation adds another stress to a structure already carrying too much weight. The danger is not one crack, it is the accumulation of cracks. That is why the human layer must be part of the story before the analysis moves outward to the whole system. Without people, the nitrate decline sounds like a remote scientific concern. With people, it becomes a warning about how climate change moves from invisible chemistry into visible life. The path is slow, but it is not imaginary. A molecule becomes a plankton constraint. A plankton constraint becomes a food web shift. A food web shift becomes uncertainty for fish and animals. That uncertainty becomes risk for communities, economies, and management systems. By the time the public sees the consequence, the chemical signal may have been present for years. That is the most haunting feature of this kind of disaster. It does not begin when people notice it. It begins when the foundation changes. In the Arctic, that foundation is not only ice. It is also nitrate, plankton, timing, and trust in seasonal patterns. If those foundations thin together, the danger is deeper than a single number on a graph. It is a warning that the systems built around the old Arctic may be standing on conditions that no longer exist. A chemical shift at Fram Strait can sound local at first. One corridor, one water mass, one nutrient, one line in a research paper. But that is not how the Arctic works. Fram Strait is not an isolated window. It is one of the places where the Arctic Ocean reports what has happened across a much wider system. Water that exits there has moved through currents, shelf seas, ice zones, river-influenced layers, plankton blooms, sediment reactions, and years of climate pressure. By the time that water reaches the strait, it is carrying a history. A nitrate decline in that water is not only a measurement from one location, it is a message from the machinery upstream. That is why the story now has to widen. The question is no longer only whether nitrate fell in polar surface water. The question is what that decline reveals about the new Arctic baseline. For decades, the Arctic baseline was imagined through ice. The central image was a white cap at the top of the planet. Scientists measured the extent of sea ice, the thickness of sea ice, the age of sea ice, the timing of melt, the timing of freeze, and the summer minimum. Those measurements remain essential. Sea ice is still one of the clearest signals of rapid polar warming. But the nitrate warning says the baseline cannot be read through ice alone. A region can lose ice and also change its chemistry. It can gain light and also lose usable nitrogen. It can show stronger productivity in one region while weakening food web efficiency in another. It can look more accessible to ships while becoming less predictable for animals and communities. It can seem open on a map while closing a nutrient gate beneath the surface. That is the larger meaning of the Fram Strait signal. The Arctic is not simply warming, it is reorganizing. Warming is a number moving upward. Reorganization is the relationship among parts changing. Ice no longer behaves the same way. Water masses do not carry the same chemical signatures. Open water seasons do not have the same biological meaning. Shallow shelves do not process organic matter in the same balance. Plankton do not necessarily grow in the same forms. Predators do not necessarily find the same prey at the same time. Communities do not necessarily inherit the same seasonal reliability. The parts still exist, but the connections among them are being rewritten. That is the difference between a change in condition and a change in system. A hotter day is a condition. A climate that makes hotter days more likely is a system shift. A plankton bloom is a condition. An ocean that changes which nutrients limit future blooms is a system shift. One low nitrate sample is a condition. A persistent nitrate decline, linked to sea ice loss, shelf production, sediment chemistry, and downstream water export is a system shift. The Arctic nitrate story matters because it belongs to the second category. It points toward a new operating regime. In the old mental model, sea ice acted as the master control. Less ice meant more light meant more biological activity. That model was never complete, but it was understandable. It gave the public a clean image, a lid removed from the ocean. The problem is that the Arctic is not a pot with a single lid. It is a network of feedbacks. When ice declines, the surface darkens and absorbs more heat. When the surface warms, freeze-up can come later. When freeze-up comes later, storms can act on open water for longer. When open water lasts longer over shallow shelves, phytoplankton may bloom differently. When more organic matter sinks, sediments may consume more oxygen and process more nitrate. When more nitrate is removed, future surface waters may become more nutrient-limited. When plankton communities change, food webs may transfer energy differently. When food webs change, animals and people face new uncertainty. This is not one straight line, it is a loop. And loops are what turn local changes into systemic risk. A system risk does not require every part to fail at the same time. It requires enough connections that stress in one layer spreads into another. In this case, climate stress begins with air temperature and sea ice. It moves into light and ocean stratification. It moves into plankton growth and sinking organic material. It moves into sediment, bacteria, and nitrogen chemistry. It moves into nutrient availability downstream. It moves into food, web structure. It moves into fisheries, subsistence harvests, community planning, and management systems. By the time the risk reaches people, it no longer looks like nitrate. It looks like uncertainty. Uncertainty about where fish will be. Uncertainty about whether a bloom will support the right grazers. Uncertainty about whether prey will arrive when predators need it. Uncertainty about whether models based on the old Arctic can guide decisions in the new one. Uncertainty about whether more open water means opportunity, danger, or both. This is why the phrase new baseline is so important. A baseline is what societies use to define normal. It is the background condition against which change is measured. It tells engineers what a coastline usually faces. It tells wildlife managers what a population usually does. It tells fisheries agencies what recruitment patterns have looked like. It tells communities what season usually brings safe travel, certain animals, or reliable harvests. It tells scientists whether a measurement is unusual or expected. But when the baseline moves, the old definition of normal becomes a trap. The Arctic is moving fast enough that yesterday's normal can become tomorrow's bad assumption. A sea ice map from a past decade may no longer describe the risk facing a shoreline. A food web model calibrated under stronger nitrate supply may no longer describe future plankton dynamics. A management plan based on historical fish distributions may fail when prey and temperature shift together. A shipping plan based on open water may underestimate storms, remoteness, poor charts, limited rescue capacity, and ecological consequences. The nitrate decline is therefore not only an ecological signal, it is a warning about knowledge systems. The systems built to observe, forecast, manage, and adapt are being forced to operate in a world where the reference points are moving. Long-term monitoring becomes more important, not less. Traditional knowledge becomes more important, not less, because local observers can notice changes in timing, animal behavior, ice safety, and harvest reliability. At the same time, both scientific models and inherited experience must confront a painful reality. The past still teaches, but it no longer guarantees. This is the heart of Arctic risk in a changing climate. The region is becoming more watched and less understood at the same time. Satellites see more than ever. Research networks collect more data than earlier generations could imagine. International reports synthesize sea ice, temperature, permafrost, wildfire, ecosystems, and human impacts. NOAA's Arctic Report Card has repeatedly described a region undergoing profound transformation, with warming, declining sea ice, and growing need for environmental intelligence. Yet the more the system changes, the harder it becomes to interpret each signal using old categories. A green surface may not mean a strong food web. A productive season may not mean a stable ecosystem. An open route may not mean a safe route. A fish appearing farther north may not mean abundance, only displacement. A clear bottle of seawater may not mean chemical health. That is what reorganization does. It breaks the easy meaning of familiar signs. The Arctic has always had extreme variability. That fact can be used wrongly to dismiss new warnings. Ice has always moved. Storms have always come. Plankton have always bloomed and declined. Animals have always shifted. But the presence of natural variability does not erase long-term change. It makes careful records more necessary. The task is not to pretend the Arctic was ever static. The task is to identify when variability begins riding on a new baseline. The Fram Strait record matters because it helps separate noise from direction. A single year can mislead. A 2-decade record can show a break. A nutrient ratio can reveal a shift that a surface image misses. A water mass leaving the Arctic can carry the fingerprint of shelf processes far away. The signal is not complete knowledge, but it is not nothing. It is the kind of clue that system science depends on. And system science rarely offers the comfort of one cause. The nitrate shift is not caused by one event in isolation. It is connected to sea ice decline, light penetration, shelf productivity, organic matter export, sediment microbial activity, denitrification, circulation, and water mass transport. Some links are stronger than others. Some consequences remain uncertain. But the shape of the risk is clear enough. The Arctic's physical transformation is feeding back into its chemistry and biology. That feedback is the point. If warming only removed ice, the story would still be grave. But when warming changes the way the ocean processes nutrients, it becomes deeper. The system is not only losing a surface feature, it is changing the rules for making life. That is why plankton makes such powerful witnesses. They live at the crossing point between physics and biology. Their growth depends on light from above, nutrients from within, temperature, mixing, and grazing. They respond quickly when those conditions change. They turn climate pressure into biological form. A plankton community is not just a collection of cells, it is a living readout of the ocean's operating conditions. If those cells become smaller, if diatoms lose advantage in key waters, if blooms become more dependent on recycled nutrients, the change may be subtle but profound. Energy may move through more steps. Carbon may sink differently. Grazers may face different food. Fish larvae may encounter mismatches. Seabirds and mammals may face consequences far removed from the original chemistry. The food web does not have to collapse to become less efficient. It only has to reroute energy through a less direct path. This is where the local chemical shift connects to climate feedbacks. The ocean is part of the global carbon system. Phytoplankton draw carbon dioxide into living matter. Some of that carbon is respired back to the water and atmosphere. Some is eaten, some sinks. The biological pump helps move carbon away from the surface. If plankton size, nutrient limitation, and recycling pathways change, then the movement of carbon can also change. The exact direction and scale may vary by region, but the principle is important. A food web shift can become a carbon cycle question. That adds another layer to the new baseline. The Arctic is not just responding to climate change, it can influence the climate system through albedo, permafrost carbon, ocean circulation, biological productivity, and carbon storage. Sea ice decline reduces reflectivity and allows darker water to absorb more heat. Thawing permafrost can release greenhouse gases. Changing ocean ecosystems can alter carbon uptake and export. These processes differ in certainty and scale, but together they show why the Arctic cannot be treated as a remote victim. It is a connected engine in the Earth system. The nitrate signal is one small gauge on that engine. Small gauges can matter when they reveal pressure building inside the machine. This is also why adaptation becomes difficult. Human systems are designed around categories. Environment departments track ecosystems. Transport agencies track shipping. Fisheries agencies track stocks. Community planners track infrastructure. Climate scientists track temperature and ice. But Arctic change does not respect those administrative borders. A nutrient decline can affect plankton. Plankton can affect fish. Fish can affect food security. Food security can affect health. Changing ice can affect travel and emergency response. New shipping can add disturbance and pollution risk. Each agency sees part of the picture, while the system moves as a whole. That is how response systems become overloaded. Not only because there are too many emergencies, but because the emergencies are linked. A coastal community may face erosion, thawing ground, changing harvests, higher fuel costs, new shipping traffic, and uncertain weather at the same time. A fisheries manager may face warming waters, shifting species, food web changes, and political pressure at the same time. A scientist may face urgent data needs, limited field access, short funding cycles, and rapidly changing baselines at the same time. A government may face infrastructure costs, sovereignty concerns, conservation responsibilities, and community relocation questions at the same time. The Arctic nitrate signal enters that crowded field as another hidden pressure. It asks whether the biological foundation is also changing while physical and social systems are already strained. That is the larger risk: compound change. Compound change is not just several problems happening side by side, it is several problems interacting. Sea ice loss can increase coastal wave exposure. Wave exposure can accelerate erosion. Erosion can threaten infrastructure. Infrastructure damage can increase costs and reduce community resilience. At the same time, sea ice loss can alter food webs. Food web change can affect harvest reliability. Reduced harvest reliability can increase dependence on expensive imported food. Higher costs can increase vulnerability. The chemical, ecological, physical, and social layers do not stay separate. The Arctic is becoming a place where many small thresholds can combine. A little less ice, a little more heat, a little more coastal erosion, a little less nitrate, a little more uncertainty in fish movement, a little less reliability in travel conditions. None of those changes alone has to look like the end of the world. Together, they can push systems beyond what existing infrastructure, governance, and culture were prepared to handle. That is why the new baseline is not only a scientific phrase, it is a lived condition. It means children grow up in a different Arctic from the one their grandparents knew. It means management agencies cannot assume species will remain inside familiar ranges. It means emergency planners cannot assume shorelines, ice roads, or storm seasons will behave like the past. It means international politics will face a region that is more accessible and more fragile at the same time. It means the global public cannot treat Arctic change as an image of distant melting. The consequences move through food, weather, carbon, shipping, and geopolitical attention. Still, the message should not become fatalistic. A system warning is not the same as a prophecy. The detection of nitrate decline shows that observation works, long-term sampling works, careful chemistry works. The fact that scientists can identify a possible shift means the change is not completely invisible. The task is to respond with the seriousness of a system problem, reduce greenhouse gas pressure, protect long-term monitoring, support Arctic communities, manage fisheries with changing food webs in mind, and treat open water not only as economic opportunity, but as ecological transformation. The danger is not that the Arctic has become unknowable. The danger is that decision-makers may act as if the old Arctic still exists. The old Arctic had more ice, older ice, different seasonal timing, stronger nitrate in the water mass studied, and a different balance between light and nutrient limitation. The emerging Arctic has more open water, more heat absorption, more shelf exposure, more sediment processing, and a food web that may be increasingly shaped by nitrogen scarcity in key regions. These are not cosmetic changes. They are changes to the operating system. And once an operating system changes, every application built on top of it begins to behave differently. That is the metaphor that captures the systemic layer. Sea ice extent is not just an icon on the screen. Nitrate is not just a number in the background code. Plankton are not just tiny decorations in the water. They are part of the operating system that allows the Arctic marine world to run. If the code changes, the outputs change. Blooms, prey, fish, carbon movement, human decisions, and risk. This is why a local chemical shift at Fram Strait can reveal a planetary warning. It shows that climate change is not only making extreme events stronger, it is altering the hidden conditions that define what normal events mean. A warmer summer is not just a warmer summer when ice, nutrients, plankton, and food webs have also changed. An open ocean is not just open ocean when the nutrient base has shifted. A productive bloom is not just a sign of health when the energy may not travel upward in the same way. The Arctic's new baseline is not a single number. It is a new relationship among light, ice, nutrients, sediments, plankton, animals, people, and time. And that is why the warning from Fram Strait should echo beyond the research community. It is a reminder that the most important climate signals are not always the loudest. Some arrive as record heat, some arrive as floodwater, some arrive as wildfire smoke, and some arrive inside clear polar water, written in a missing nutrient, carried by a current through a narrow strait, waiting for someone to understand that a tiny plankton warning can mean the whole system has begun to move. At this point in the story, the danger is not only misunderstanding the Arctic. The danger is overstatement. A scientific warning becomes weaker when it tries to sound larger than the evidence. The Fram Strait nitrate signal is serious enough without turning it into a cartoon apocalypse. It does not need false certainty. It does not need a claim that the Arctic Ocean is dead. It does not need a straight line from one chemical measurement to every fishery, every whale, every seabird, and every storm. The truth is already severe. The system may be changing at its foundation, and the foundation is difficult to see. That is why the evidence has to be separated from the speculation. The first thing the evidence does say is clear. In the long record from Fram Strait, polar surface water leaving the Arctic carried much less nitrate after the break, around 2009, than it did before. The reported average declined from about 3.1 to about 1.7 micromolar. That is not a mood. That is not an image. That is a measured chemical change in a water mass that carries information from the Arctic system upstream. The second thing the evidence supports is the connection to a changing ice regime. The Arctic has lost sea ice, especially old and thick ice, and the open water season over major shelf regions has expanded. Less ice allows more light to reach shallow waters. More light can allow more plankton production where light had previously limited growth. That part of the story is not invented. It fits the observed transformation of the Arctic surface and the biological response seen in many regions. The third thing the evidence supports is the mechanism of benthic denitrification. This is not a mysterious force. It is a known microbial process in sediments. Organic matter sinks. Microbes break it down. In low oxygen zones, nitrate can be used in respiration and converted into nitrogen gas or related gaseous forms. When that happens, fixed nitrogen leaves the pool that ordinary phytoplankton can readily use. In the Arctic shelf setting, where broad, shallow seas connect surface blooms to seafloor sediments, that process can matter at large scale. The fourth thing the evidence suggests is a shift toward nitrate limitation. That phrase must be handled carefully. It does not mean there is no nitrate anywhere. It does not mean plankton cannot grow at all. It means nitrate may increasingly become the ingredient that restricts growth in key waters and seasons. In a system once strongly limited by light, that is a major change. The gatekeeper moves from the sky above to the chemistry within. The fifth thing the evidence makes plausible is a change in plankton community structure. When nitrate becomes scarcer, smaller cells can often gain an advantage over larger cells because they are better suited to low nutrient conditions. Larger plankton, including many diatoms, often play an important role in efficient food transfer to larger grazers. Smaller cells can support life too, but they may send more energy through microbial loops. That can make the path from sunlight to fish less direct. This is the core of what is related. Sea ice loss is related, more light over shallow shelves is related, increased plankton production in some regions is related, more sinking organic matter is related, sediment microbial processing is related, denitrification is related, lower nitrate downstream is related, potential food web reorganization is related. But not everything that happens in the Arctic can be placed inside this one explanation. That distinction matters. If a fish population moves north, nitrate decline may be one part of the wider ecological context, but temperature, prey movement, fishing pressure, predator changes, oxygen, salinity, and habitat shifts may also matter. If seabirds fail to breed in a given year, plankton timing and prey availability may be involved, but storms, disease, predation, heat stress, and local food conditions may also be involved. If whales appear in new places, a changing food web may help explain movement. But migration, prey distribution, noise, ship traffic, and ice conditions all have to be considered. The nitrate signal is not a universal key that unlocks every Arctic mystery. It is one powerful clue inside a larger system. This is where full stories can enter. One full story says that more open Arctic water means the ocean will simply become more productive and beneficial for life. That story is too simple because it ignores nutrient limitation, food web structure, timing, and seafloor chemistry. Another false story says that nitrate decline means the Arctic food web has already collapsed. That story is also too simple because ecosystems can reorganize without immediate total collapse. They can remain alive while becoming different, less efficient, less predictable, or less able to support the same species in the same way. Both false stories fail for the same reason. They confuse direction with destiny. A trend is not a complete future. A warning is not a finished disaster. A mechanism is not proof of every consequence. The responsible conclusion is more precise. The Arctic shows signs that a changing ice regime may have pushed parts of its marine nitrogen cycle into a new state, and that new state could favor smaller plankton and alter the transfer of energy through the food web. That is enough to matter. Another thing must also be kept separate. This story is not primarily about ocean acidification. Ocean acidification is real and important, especially for organisms that build shells or skeletons from calcium carbonate. But the central mechanism here is different. This story is about nitrogen biogeochemistry, nitrate availability, and denitrification over shallow shelves. Confusing the two would blur the science. The Arctic faces multiple chemical pressures, but each pressure has its own mechanism. The same discipline applies to tipping point language. A chemical tipping point does not have to mean a point of no return in the dramatic sense. It may mean a threshold where feedbacks begin supporting a new state. Less ice creates more light. More light creates more production. More production feeds sediment microbes. Sediment microbes remove more fixed nitrogen. Lower nitrate then changes future plankton growth. That loop can push the system away from its earlier behavior. But the exact reversibility, speed, and geographic reach still require careful study. The words may have crossed are important. They do not weaken the story, they make it honest. They acknowledge that the evidence is strong enough to raise alarm, but not strong enough to claim perfect knowledge of every future outcome. In science, uncertainty is not the same as ignorance. Uncertainty can mean the system is complex, the measurements are difficult, and the consequences are still unfolding. It can also mean that waiting for absolute certainty would be reckless, because by the time every consequence is visible, the underlying shift may be much harder to manage. There are also things that may only be coincidental in time. A warm year in one part of the Arctic may occur alongside low nitrate without being caused directly by that local nitrate condition. A poor seabird season may happen in the same era as nitrogen cycle change without being fully explained by it. A fishery problem may overlap with the nitrate decline but still depend more immediately on marine heat waves, harvest pressure, prey changes, or management decisions. Coincidence does not become causation just because both events fit a dramatic narrative. That does not make the nitrate signal harmless. It means the chain of causality has to be built carefully. The real risk is not that one number explains everything. The real risk is that the number marks a shift in the conditions underneath everything. A lower nutrient baseline can make the food web more sensitive to other stresses. A system already pressured by warming, acidification, sea ice loss, shifting species, and human activity may have less resilience when its nutrient foundation changes. The nitrate decline may not be the only driver of future disruption, but it can change the background against which every other driver operates. That is what makes it systemic. A storm damages what it strikes. A baseline shift changes what future storms, seasons, and ecological events mean. A single poor bloom can be an event. A new nutrient regime changes the odds of future blooms behaving differently. A single failed harvest can be a hardship. A less predictable food web changes the planning horizon for whole communities. The distinction between event and baseline is the difference between weather and climate, between a bad year and a changed era. The evidence also cannot yet say exactly how far the consequences will travel. Fram Strait connects the Arctic and the North Atlantic, but the path from nutrient chemistry to regional fisheries is not a simple pipeline. Water mixes, species move. Local conditions intervene. Some areas may receive nutrients from Atlantic inflow or vertical mixing. Some regions may continue to experience strong productivity. Some organisms may adapt or shift. Some food webs may reorganize in ways that are not entirely negative for every species. A changing Arctic does not create one winner and one loser. It creates uneven winners, uneven losers, and many uncertain transitions. That unevenness must be part of the truth. Some smaller plankton may gain, some microbial pathways may become more active, some species may move into newly suitable waters, some fisheries may see temporary opportunities. But temporary opportunity does not cancel systemic risk. A few winners in a reorganization do not mean the old food web remains intact. A shipping route opening does not mean the coastline is safer. A productivity increase in one metric does not mean the ecosystem is healthier. The question is not whether life continues. Life will continue. The question is what form of life dominates, how energy moves, who receives it, who loses access to it, and whether human systems can keep up with the change. The strongest scientifically defensible warning is therefore this: the Arctic Ocean may be shifting from a system where sea ice mainly controlled access to light toward a system where nutrient removal and nitrate limitation increasingly control the quality of biological production. That shift may favor smaller plankton, weaken direct energy transfer to larger animals in some settings, alter carbon pathways, and increase uncertainty for food webs and communities. That statement is less sensational than saying the Arctic food chain is finished. It is also more frightening because it describes a system that can change while still looking alive. The surface may remain blue, the water may remain clear, a satellite may still detect chlorophyll, a season may still produce a bloom, fish may still be caught, birds may still fly, seals may still hunt. Nothing about the warning requires immediate emptiness. The danger is that the old relationships among these things may no longer hold. This is why the plankton warning should be taken seriously without being exaggerated. Plankton are not proof of apocalypse, they are proof of sensitivity. They show that the ocean's smallest organisms are already living inside a different balance of light and nutrients. They show that chemistry can change before the public sees a dramatic collapse. They show that the Arctic's transformation is entering the machinery of life. The honest conclusion is not certainty of disaster. The honest conclusion is loss of confidence in the old system. The old assumption said that less ice would mainly create more room for Arctic productivity. The new evidence says that more room and more light can arrive with a hidden nutrient cost. The old image showed a lid lifting from the ocean. The new image shows a drain opening underneath the food web. Both images can be true at the same time. That is why the story is difficult. That is why it matters. The warning is real because the mechanism is real, the measurements are serious, and the consequences are plausible. The uncertainty is real because ecosystems are complex, regional differences matter, and future responses are not fully known. The boundary between those two truths is where credible climate storytelling has to stand. The image at the beginning was almost empty. A bottle of seawater, cold, clear, taken from Fram Strait, carried out of the Arctic by currents that have touched ice, shelves, sediments, blooms, and darkness. Nothing in that bottle looked broken. Nothing in it looked like disaster. No flame rose from it. No wave crashed from it. No animal cried out from inside it. To the human eye, it was only water. But the warning was there. It was there in the nitrate that had fallen. It was there in the shift from water that once carried more usable nitrogen to water that now carries less. It was there in the possibility that the Arctic Ocean has moved from a world where life was mostly waiting for light to a world where light arrives and the nutrient base may no longer answer in the same way. It was there in plankton, the smallest witnesses, responding before the rest of the food web could make the change visible. That is what makes this story different from the disasters that dominate screens. There is no single impact moment. There is no one wave, one landfall, one burned neighborhood, one collapsed bridge. The Arctic chemical warning does not behave like an event that can be filmed from above. It behaves like a condition that changes what future events mean. It is not the sound of a system breaking. It is the soundless movement of a system learning a new rule. For years, the dominant image of Arctic change has been the disappearance of ice. That image remains true. It remains urgent. Sea ice reflects sunlight, protects coastlines, shapes habitats, regulates heat, and defines seasons for animals and people. Its decline is one of the clearest signs that the planet is warming. But the nitrate signal shows that the story cannot end at the ice edge. The loss of ice is not only a surface change, it can reach downward into the chemistry of the ocean, into the sediments of the shelf seas, into the microbes that breathe through nitrate, and into the plankton that begin the food web. The central message is simple, but not comforting. The Arctic is not only losing ice, it may be losing part of the old chemical foundation that helped turn seasonal light into food. That does not mean the Arctic Ocean is dead. It does not mean every species is doomed. It does not mean every bloom will fail, every fishery will collapse, or every community will face the same future. Those claims would be too easy, too loud, and too false. The real warning is more precise. A living system can remain alive while becoming less familiar. It can continue to bloom while changing which cells dominate. It can continue to feed animals while shifting timing, size, location, and reliability. It can keep moving while the old map becomes less useful. A disaster does not always begin with absence. Sometimes it begins with replacement. Large plankton give way to smaller plankton in some waters. Direct food pathways give way to longer microbial loops. Predictable bloom timing gives way to mismatches. A nutrient-rich starting point gives way to nitrate limitation. Ice-controlled seasons give way to chemistry-controlled constraints. The system does not vanish, it reorganizes. And reorganization can be harder to fear because it does not always look like loss at first. A brighter Arctic Ocean can still be a hungrier Arctic Ocean. That is the sentence that should remain after the numbers fade. More sunlight can enter the water, but plankton still need nitrate to build cells. Open water can expand, but the food web still needs the right nutrients at the right time. Productivity can rise in one measure, but food transfer can weaken in another. A map can show opportunity while the chemistry shows strain. The Arctic can appear more open to human ambition at the same time it becomes less stable for the living systems already there. This is the deep unease in the plankton warning. Human beings tend to notice the top of systems, the roof, the surface, the visible animal, the market price, the road, the house, the storm, the flame, but many failures begin at the bottom. A foundation shifts before the wall cracks. A root system dries before the tree falls. A bloodstream changes before the body collapses. An ocean food web changes first in molecules, cells, and timing. Plankton are small enough to be ignored and important enough to define the future of everything above them. They are not symbols added to make the story emotional. They are the first layer of the biological economy. They translate sunlight into food. They turn chemistry into life. They determine, in part, whether energy moves upward efficiently or circulates through smaller and smaller steps. A change in their world is not a footnote. It is a change in the terms of survival for the organisms that depend on them. The Arctic warning is also a warning about time. The most visible climate disasters often happen quickly. A storm makes landfall, a river rises, a fire jumps a road, a heatwave fills emergency rooms. These moments deserve attention because they harm people directly and immediately, but slower disasters can be just as consequential. They alter the baseline. They change the conditions under which all future storms, seasons, harvests, migrations, and recoveries occur. They make familiar events behave in unfamiliar ways. A nitrate decline belongs to this slower category. It does not strike like lightning, it changes the soil of the sea. A lower nitrate baseline can make future blooms different before anyone sees the result in fish. It can change which plankton succeed before seabirds fail to find enough prey. It can alter the microbial machinery before a management agency notices that historical models are losing accuracy. It can reshape the energy path before a community freezer is less full, before a fishing season becomes less predictable, before an animal arrives late or thin or in the wrong place. By the time the consequence becomes visible, the cause may feel distant. That is why long-term science matters. Without years of sampling at Fram Strait, the warning might remain invisible. Without patient nutrient measurements, the clear water would stay silent. Without researchers willing to compare decades, separate noise from signal, and connect chemistry to ice and sediments, the system would change without language. The discovery is unsettling, but it is also proof that attention works. The Arctic can still be read. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to recognize that the old story is no longer sufficient. There is a strange kind of hope in that. Not the easy hope that everything will be fine, not the empty hope that adaptation will solve every loss, not the commercial hope that an ice-free ocean is simply a new frontier. The hope is narrower and more serious. A hidden signal has been detected before all its consequences are fully visible. A chemical change has been named. A mechanism has been traced. A warning has been pulled out of clear water. That kind of knowledge does not erase risk. It creates responsibility. If the Arctic food web is being reshaped by climate-driven nitrogen loss, then the response cannot be only local. It cannot be only a better fishery rule, a stronger harbour, a new shipping chart, or a larger research grant, although all of those may matter. The deeper pressure comes from a warming planet. Reducing greenhouse gas emissions remains the broadest way to reduce the force pushing the Arctic into unfamiliar states. Supporting Arctic communities remains essential because they face the earliest and most layered consequences. Protecting long-term observation remains essential because invisible change cannot be managed if it is not measured. The future is not a single locked door. It is a range of possible Arctic oceans. One future contains continued warming, longer open water seasons, stronger shelf processing, deeper nitrate limitation in key regions, smaller plankton dominating more often, food webs becoming less efficient, and communities facing greater uncertainty. Another future contains serious emissions reductions, stronger monitoring, more cautious management, better support for northern communities, and a clearer understanding of how biological systems are changing before they reach crisis. The difference between those futures is not decided by plankton alone. It is decided by the pressure placed on the system and by how quickly societies accept the warning. Still, even the better future is not a return to the old Arctic. That must be said plainly. Some changes have already happened, some ice has already been lost, some baselines have already moved. The task is not to rewind the entire system to a past that no longer exists. The task is to prevent the new Arctic from becoming more unstable than it has to be. The task is to preserve as much resilience as possible. The task is to stop treating each signal as isolated when the evidence shows a connected system. The plankton warning reveals that connection. Ice loss is not separate from light. Light is not separate from production. Production is not separate from sinking organic matter. Sinking organic matter is not separate from sediment bacteria. Sediment bacteria are not separate from nitrate. Nitrate is not separate from plankton size. Plankton size is not separate from zooplankton, fish, seabirds, seals, whales, people, carbon, and time. The chain is long, but it is not imaginary. It is the way the ocean works. That is the truth that makes the warning haunting. There is no outside layer where climate change stops. It enters the air, the ice, the water, the mud, the microbes, the cells, the animals, the economies, the food systems, the memories of communities, and the assumptions inside models. It changes the surface, and then the hidden machinery. It turns a satellite image into a chemistry problem. It turns a chemistry problem into a food web question. It turns a food web question into a human question. What kind of world is being built when the first alarms come from things too small to see? That question reaches beyond the Arctic. Many systems on Earth are giving warnings in forms that are easy to miss. Coral reefs warn through heat stress before bleaching becomes a graveyard. Forests warn through dryness, insect pressure, and species shifts before fire becomes a wall of flame. Rivers warn through changing snowpack and runoff before reservoirs fall. Cities warn through heat islands and overloaded drainage before streets flood or power systems fail. The Arctic Ocean is now warning through nitrate, sediments, and plankton. The pattern is the same. The visible disaster is often the last sentence, not the first. The first sentence is a measurement, a ratio, a stress, a timing mismatch, a weakening foundation, a system still functioning but under new rules. That is why the story must end where it began, with clear water. A bottle from Fram Strait sits on a deck or in a laboratory, looking almost innocent. Inside, it is not a monster. It is not poison in the cinematic sense. It is an absence, a thinning of usable nitrogen, a clue that the ocean's nutrient machinery has shifted. The water does not explain itself. It does not announce that a shelf sea has processed more organic matter, that bacteria have converted nitrate into gas, that future plankton may face a different constraint. It simply holds the evidence. Science gives the evidence a voice. And the voice says that the Arctic warning is not only above the ocean, where ice retreats, it is also below the ocean, where sediments breathe, nutrients transform, and the smallest organisms begin to change the meaning of the whole food web. There is no need to make the ending hopeless. Hopelessness is another form of oversimplification. It pretends the future is already complete. It drains responsibility from the present. The more accurate ending is heavier and more demanding. The Arctic system is changing, but it is still being observed. The mechanisms are complex, but not unknowable. The consequences are uncertain, but not harmless. The warning is early, and early warnings are valuable precisely because they arrive before every door has closed. There is also no reason to make the ending light. A chemical tipping point does not become small because it is quiet. A plankton shift does not become minor because the organisms are microscopic. A nutrient decline does not become harmless because it lacks a dramatic photograph. The world has already learned, again and again, that the invisible can become structural. Heat trapped by gases cannot be seen directly by the eye, yet it changes weather, ice, oceans, and fire. Acidity changing in seawater can be invisible, yet it alters shell building. Oxygen declining at depth can be invisible, yet it reshapes habitat. Nitrate falling in polar water can be invisible, yet it may change the food web from its base. The Arctic Ocean may have crossed a chemical threshold, or it may be moving dangerously close to one. The careful language matters, but the caution in the wording should not be mistaken for comfort. The signal is strong enough to demand attention because it shows the Arctic becoming a different kind of ocean, not merely a warmer version of the old one. The old story was about melting. The new story is about what melting unlocks. It unlocks light, it unlocks heat absorption, it unlocks longer open water seasons, it unlocks new human access and new hazards. And now, perhaps, it unlocks a seafloor chemical drain that removes part of the usable nitrogen from the system that plankton need to feed the living Arctic. That is the final turn. The ice was never the whole foundation. It was the visible roof over a much larger structure. Beneath it were nutrients, currents, sediments, microbes, plankton, animals, and people. As the roof opens, the structure below is not simply illuminated, it is being altered. The event in Fram Strait will continue to be studied. New data may refine the timeline, sharpen the mechanism, complicate the regional picture, or reveal feedbacks not yet understood. That is how science works. But the central warning has already become difficult to ignore. A world can change before its change becomes visible, and the smallest organisms can be the first to say that the old rules have failed. The bottle of water remains clear. That is what makes it so disturbing. It looks unchanged, while carrying the chemistry of change. It looks empty, while holding the first evidence of a food web under pressure. It looks quiet, while speaking for an ocean whose surface has opened and whose foundation may be thinning. The Arctic warning does not ask only how much ice will disappear. It asks what kind of life can be built in the water that remains.